movies, we do lectures, we do Studium Generale, which is open to the public and students. We do concert series. It goes on and on. And one of the things that we sometimes struggle with is trying to figure out how do we get all this stuff to kind of hang together thematically. And we were talking about that last year, and somebody mentioned to us that the United Nations each year picks an educational theme for the year. And then they spend the whole year doing educational activities around that theme. And it just so happened that this year's theme for the United Nations is water. And we started talking about that, and as we think about that, what could we choose that more significantly defines us here on the peninsula than water? We're surrounded by it. Our ecosystem is sustained by it. It is a central part of who we are and who we're becoming. And there are lots of issues that we're exploring around that whole idea of water. What will happen as our climate continues to change? How will that affect the way water, how we see water, how we use water in our society? So we've got a whole series of events this year where we're exploring that theme of water. And this, one of the things we wanted to do when we started talking about this is because water is so vital to this particular region that we're living in, it's also vital historically, culturally, spiritually, to the native tribes who have been here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And we wanted to make sure that we were capturing or offering up some perspectives from a native perspective about why water is important and why it is such an important thing for us to think about, to understand, to grapple with as we go forward. So we feel that this particular lecture series is a wonderful part, going to be a wonderful part of our year-long focus on water as a natural resource and water in our world. So tonight is the first lecture in this series, and we're very pleased to have Micah McCarty with us today. I'm very much looking forward to what he has to say tonight. There are two more in this series. And there is a handout. Make sure you get one before you leave if you didn't get one. The next one is January 23rd. That's Thursday. And that one will be is entitled Water and Spirit, Ocean and River Prayers and Storytelling. And that will be presented by Ted Noel and Elaine Grinnell. And then on Thursday, May 29th, Charlotte Penn from the Quileute tribe will be presenting a talk on the canoe journey to Bella Bella 2014. And very much looking forward to that as well. So mark those on your calendar and plan to be back with us later on in the year as we continue to learn more about water in our world. So again, thanks for being here. We appreciate it. Hope you enjoy the evening. And I'm going to turn it over to our students next. Come on.
Good evening, everyone. I am Drew Andrieski. Everyone calls me Drew. I am the president of Shades of Color Club. And this is...
I'm Susan Hamilton. I'm a full-time student at Peninsula College going for my AA, and I'm treasurer of the Shades of Color Club. And our club, Shades of Color Club, we focus on celebrating our diverse cultures and promoting unity on campus and in our community. And I'm proud to say we are the most happening and active club on campus. And we're very honored to co-sponsor with the Longhouse Lecture Series examining tribal perspectives on water, and we're honored to be able to help introduce Micah McCarty.
In 2005, Chairman McCarty traveled to Europe as an exchange fellow for the German Marshall Fund of the United States, GMF, a public policy and grant-making institution dedicated to promoting better understanding and cooperation between North America and Europe on transatlantic and global issues. Currently, he serves as a special assistant to the president on tribal relations at Evergreen College. And in addition to his former leadership and policymaking roles, Mr. McCarty is a celebrated artist recognized by Washington State Art Commission as a master artist. He was a spotlight artist of the Longhouse Art Gallery in 2012. And, well, without further ado, please welcome Mr. McCarty.
Good evening, everybody. Enjoying the cold weather? Well, I had a nice drive up. I had a nice call from one of my cousins. It's good to be with family and friends again. Recognize some of my tribal members. I'd like to acknowledge Councilman Brian Sebek. I had the pleasure of serving with him for a few years towards the end of my tenure on council. I just want to kind of lay out a verbal disclaimer that I'm here in my own capacity based on the experiences that I gained through my history in tribal government. And prior to tribal government, I believe I learned quite a few things from the Makah Commission, the attorneys that worked with us, and the interaction that I had at that table with a lot of the federal family members that had come and consult with the tribe and the Makah Commission. So I think a big part of my perspective and what I believe is sort of a training program that I just naturally look into things inquisitively and see the interconnectedness of things. I have to acknowledge the council back at that time when the Makah Commission was put together, and the elders that sat at that table helped provide a rich perspective, or a group of rich perspectives for me to draw from. And so I think a big part of the reason why I'm here is because I've been fortunate enough to be in circles of really wise and intelligent people, multiple circles of wise and intelligent people. And if it wasn't for the Makah people that elected me, I never would have gained even a broader, more worldly and global perspective on what indigenous rights mean to not just our own people for self-determination, but also our place in the fabric of global society, that we are, in fact, an important and vital part of the biodiversity of the planet, because we are manifestations of this natural world that we live in. Who we are and where we come from is an expression in our artwork. It's an expression in our songs. And that long-term observation of who we are and where we come from also has scientific value, that we know things and we know an oral history about places that no scientist, no matter how PhD deep they are, can come in and immediately understand some of these things. We can't articulate everything in scientific vernacular either, so there's a symbiose that needs to be brought together with traditional ecological knowledge and this scientific world of ours. I want to express a little bit of perspective on what I really believe is probably one of the most fundamental problems facing the water crisis that we have, both of the water crises. The crisis of ocean acidification and the crisis of freshwater supply. I think in part of my experience with the Makah Whaling Commission, I just have to put it out there, I'm not naive to gutter science. Science used to prove a point. And the reason why I say this is because there's a number of organizations out in our world that have really good intentions. And they were probably put into place out of necessity. But I think in some cases, that necessity is no longer the magnitude of what it once was. And I think this is where I think money equally corrupts conservation, as well as greed can corrupt sound business practices. And one example I'll use, and this is something that I've heard with the National Marine Sanctuary organization. I was fortunate enough to be invited by the national director to go to Alpena, Michigan, and there's 13 sanctuary systems in the United States. The one in Michigan, in Alpena, was the host that year. I think they came out to the Olympic coast a year later. But the coordinators of the sanctuary programs themselves are federal bureaucrats, and then the council coordination chairs. So every sanctuary has a sanctuary advisory council, and that's sort of the public arm to help advise the sanctuary of public opinion. And so there was a pretty captive audience for this video that was put together by John Talbot. And John Talbot is a very accomplished cinematographer. He's done some of the most amazing video work of marine mammals in the ocean, very gifted artist. But I think the part that really struck me is sort of a challenge to finding some common sense in this world of sustainability, ecosystem management, and who defines those. There was this montage in this video that was showcasing baby seals getting butchered on an ice floe. So, really cute animals, blood and death right there. Another image came up after that was a factory whaling ship, big bloody carcass coming up over. And then after that, there was this factory trawler, a big fishing vessel. And then this statement was made on video, and it was very closely, almost exact the way I remembered it, was that 90% of the world's long-lived fish in the ocean are gone. So 90% of the world's large and long-lived fish in the ocean are gone. And he didn't qualify it. He didn't say to what degree or what this really meant. Then just jumped into the whole discussion about we need more attention into this area. We need more help in these areas. We need to really push. And it's kind of part of, I think, what was also going on and what still is going on is that some of the NGOs in the United States really gravitate towards certain agencies within the federal family. And they really attempt to create a policy agenda with that agency. And so the Makah Tribe and other four coastal treaty tribes saw this coming down the road when it comes to Pacific Fisheries Management Council agendas. More and more of these conservation agendas were starting to push into play in the way management decisions are made. But I want to get back to that statement. 90% of the world's long-lived and large fish are gone. What does a layperson think about that statement? Does anybody think of the word extinction? Raise up your hand if that comes to mind. You get a statement and you jump to a conclusion. I had to counter that discussion because it begged to be confronted. And I agreed with some of the concerns that I've heard from maybe more unbiased or a little bit more objective kind of points of view around the fact that, yes, fisheries all around the world have seen sort of a shrinking of age classes. And in some heavily fished species, when they're managed for optimum sustainable yield instead of optimum sustainable population, you get a compression of the life cycle. And so some fish are forced to reproduce sooner in their life than before because of pressures in their environment have become such as that. But the fact that most of these species of these 90% of the large fish and long-lived fish are in fact viable populations still. And the analogy could be old-growth forests and tree farms. And so that's one thing that I think more people, including educators such as who we have here in leadership as part of the education community, is that we need to have more common sense in how do we really define these kinds of situations. And what other sort of things I think have come out about this with respect to ocean acidification is that because we have these battles over fisheries conservation and these other issues, one more issue such as ocean acidification can be another bandwagon agenda and another reason and another cause to shut things down. And I think what I experienced with these sort of questions regarding fisheries and resource extraction, marine conservation areas, marine spatial planning areas, at the National Ocean Council we had a huge organization of fisheries managers, conservationists, I mean, you name it. Anybody that was a part of this Obama National Ocean Council Governance Coordination Committee and this big national agenda, it was like a 2-day conference, and we were kind of deciding, how do you take these first steps forward in an attempt to look at all of the laws and regulations that currently govern ocean uses. And there's over 250 of them. There's almost 300 of these laws and regulations. And what struck me right off the bat was that some of the organizers conducting these workshops and all these different breakouts about marine spatial planning, I thought they really got into trade-off scenarios really quickly, and I think that's also one of the problems. And what I think about is how do you define things that are more compatible? How do you create solutions, and how do you find a middle ground for compatibility before you start drawing lines in the sand? And I think just, in general, thinking about ocean acidification, watersheds, I think of stories about the Hoko River before the prison went in and after the prison went in. The recovery plan at the Hoko River hasn't been the same since the prison went in, and it's all about in-stream flow. In-stream flow, the amount of water in the river is also directly correlated to the water quality of the river. Less water makes it less capable of holding a colder temperature that the salmon like. And so there's just a prevailing fact. You can measure that. And the WIRAs, or these watersheds out here, have been consistently showing a dwindling supply, even in more intact systems. In-stream flow has been declining year in, year out. And then think about ocean acidification, and what is that? What does that mean? What's the cause of this? When we can look at financial records of oil and gas and coal companies and see that there's been trillions and trillions of tons since the dawn of the industrial age of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And water is a huge vehicle that moves. It's a part of the hydrological cycle in the upper atmosphere, and it doesn't escape. And it comes back down into the earth, and what is the biggest surface of the earth is the ocean. And so the ocean chemistry is literally becoming more and more corrosive as we speak. It's a 40-year cycle. So what we have now in the ocean is what was emitted 40 years ago. And, think about some of the things that I'm just reminding myself about, some of the things when I've talked with groups of people, talking about finding that common ground and finding a common perspective on things. That look inside your own body. We have water in our blood. We are a major percentage of our body mass is water. And if this water cycle on our planet doesn't really leave the atmosphere, it means that the molecules that we're walking with could be the same molecules that any of your ancestors were walking with. That's how connected we are, that we are part of the ecosystem, we are part of the environment. And I think what kind of gets in the way of some of the indigenous values and indigenous prerogative in policy is that some people try to overcompensate the human footprint. Some people try to overcompensate what has already been done and try to take humans out of the ecosystem. And it's really problematic to me in the sense that there's a strong tradition among the Makah people and others on integrated resource management. We went with what the seasons provided, and we didn't take too much. And so our reliance and dependence was spread across a whole community, a whole diverse community of wildlife. It wasn't smash and grab, catch all the halibut you can, and leave the Indians to pick up the pieces after they have been depleted. So when you think about these modern senses of what some people talk about ecosystem-based management, they really mean taking people out of the environment and let the environment put itself back together again. But oftentimes that really can't happen because the environmental niche of various species has become so out of balance. One example that I like to talk about, because I believe strongly that the Makah whaling tradition is a valid traditional and also a natural predation heritage. And the wolf, reintroduction of the wolves in Yellowstone, ethnobotanists for a long time were studying the area, and they knew that herbivores had become sort of out of balance and overpopulated in that area. And so when the wolves were reintroduced, some ethnobotanists were really excited to see that some of the plant life that they thought was extinct in that area had come back. And so that's just one small example. But one of the things that I indicated I was going to talk about also is sort of the balance and the cause and effect of some of the strongest challenges right now to salmon recovery and salmon habitat. I don't know the numbers, but I think it's a valid question to ask people to do some real solid science. And I'm thinking of, how do you have, a community of, real serious scientists that will try to do a real honest appraisal of what was the carrying capacity of salmon and salmon habitat when the Marine Mammal Protection Act was put in place. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act was in, 73 or so? It was around the same time as the Bolt decision, ironically. And then what is the carrying capacity of these same river systems now? What was the population level of seals and sea lions associated with these river systems and their oceans? What was that population level at that time? And I hear from one of my longtime friends, I was fortunate enough to attend Wahoo Indian School on the Nisqually River. I remember seeing old man Billy Frank when I was a little kid. Me and I think we were both second grade. We've been lifelong friends. He's lived growing up fishing the river, and he's seen and witnessed the different sizes of runs. But one of the things that is, really painful for some of the fishermen is they're seeing growing numbers of seals and sea lions down at the mouth of the river, and they're eating I don't know how many salmon a day, but the impact on what sort of sustainable yield can be harvested on these different runs is becoming bigger and bigger. So what we're seeing is the traditional dependence on a resource has already been negatively impacted by westernized systems of irrigation, municipal pressures, dams, energy. All these other developments have sort of taken so much from what the rivers used to hold, and then now Indians are being asked and sometimes forced to even give up more for a population that may be considered recovered. And so one thing that I would propose is that should the Marine Mammal Protection Act for some species be recoined as a Marine Mammal Management Act. But I think what that sort of question will do is it will go right into a buzzsaw of political polarity. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that natives face today is that there's such polarized politics around natural resource use and natural resource conservation that Indians, in some cases, are either the darling or the villain. And it depends on who it is. And for instance, with Anderson versus Evans, the case that basically, in my opinion, is still holding the Makah Treaty right behind Wales hostage. My own opinion on this is that, and based on some fact, I believe that Judge Gould was appointed by Reagan, I believe, and I think Clinton appointed Judge Berzon. There was an 11th Circuit judge that wrote a dissenting opinion in this Anderson versus Evans case. But just to break it down, I think, and just to try to make it as respectful as possible, but just to break it down on the stereotypes, is that Indian people have seen some extreme conservatives on a very anti-Indian agenda, sometimes outright racist. But on the other political extreme, I think for Judge Berzon, are treaty right to hunt whales was just philosophically inconvenient to her. And so there was this attempt to ignore applicable case law that could have supported a different decision on our behalf. And so they legislated from the bench. But the other factor that I mentioned earlier on in-stream flow is that it's another sort of set of equations to try to think of is what was the carrying capacity of those river systems for salmon back at the beginning of the Marine Mammal Protection Act? What was the population level of those seals and sea lions back in 73? And then how many toilets did we have in the I-5 corridor at that time? Now we're flushing potable water through millions of more toilets up and down the I-5 corridor. And so we can talk about problems and all the issues, but how do we develop a discussion that is open-minded, pragmatic, and constructive? And I'm happy to say that I've been involved in a few efforts to do just that. We pioneered stronger relations with the National Marine Sanctuary System, even though we didn't agree with some of the policy agendas, but we had some common incentive to understand the natural environment of the ocean. It wasn't hard to understand that our bioregion of the Pacific Northwest is one of the most dynamic ecologies on the planet. Swift Shore Bank, just by itself, is one of the 5 most dynamic marine ecologies on Earth for productivity, biological diversity, and then just the natural energy. But its connectivity to the Puget Sound, Salish Sea, all the watersheds all the way up and down the I-5 corridor. From the Makah perspective that I've learned is that we've had to become very aware of what goes on in the Puget Sound because those fish swim right past me today. And so our management plans had to be very adaptive, not only to our own environment, but we had to pay attention to what goes on upstream. And so when we start hearing discussions about people wanting Indians to give up more salmon for not just seals and sea lions now, but for orca recovery, we have to pay attention. And we've been paying attention, and I know we're still paying attention. But the fact that the diversity of what we have, I think, is a strong resilience factor moving forward with climate change. Ocean acidification is another really, really scary one. I had the honor, privilege, and nightmare of sitting on Christine McGuire's Blue Ribbon panel on ocean acidification. And it's a really scary prospect of what is this going to mean to our dependence on seafood. Indian treaty rights at risk. We've got Billy Frank and the Fish Commission looking up the watersheds and all these recovery plans, and the fact that the federal family doesn't have anybody in charge. There's no coordination. The same reason why the Obama administration is still attempting to coordinate national ocean policy and marine spatial planning. That is a siloed suite of different agencies with different parts of oversight on the ocean. Well, the same exists upstream. There's no federal coordination to the extent that we think needs to be. But then when you get out into the ocean, what can we do? And thinking about traditional resources and then just natural resources that are biased. We had a couple of interested parties, including some folks from Battelle National Lab, the Department of Energy, because the Makah Tribe at one time was a really strong partner in the Wave Energy Project Initiative. We kind of became a pretty interesting blip on the radar screen for people looking to develop more alternative energy. And so when I think about energy and what we've been depending on, we can talk about the carbon footprint of fossil fuels. What's the salmon footprint of dams? What's the salmon footprint of municipal water? What's the salmon footprint of irrigation? But how do we replace that? How do you augment that? Tokyo's done a lot of things. huge population of people. They've had to develop more sustainable infrastructure for wiser use of their water. Thinking about ocean energy, wave energy, wind energy, tidal energy. How do we offset our dependence on traditional resources that are more conventional, not necessarily traditional? Westernized tradition or westernized conventional systems of feeding people, energizing people. All of these problems that we're facing have solutions. And I think just because I had such an interest in looking into these solutions, I had a couple of really, I think, awesome, unique opportunities to be introduced to some really awesome technologies that I also think need to be a part of this conversation. The U.S. Navy, for instance, right now has become probably one of the greenest arms of the federal government. And I think one of the most amazing potentials for one type of technology that they're working on is they have this membrane designed that can wrap a balloon, and they push it really deep into the ocean, deep enough so where carbon dioxide will seep right through that membrane. Then they're drawing that gas out at the surface where they've already made hydrogen, and then they're mixing that carbon dioxide that they pulled from the deep with the hydrogen, and they're making jet fuel. And they think they have a formula where they can make this jet fuel for about $3 a gallon. And the incentive on the Navy, it's a national security issue. Why be dependent on somebody else's resources when you can generate your own resources out of the ocean? That in and by itself, I think there should be some kind of an equation designed. There's right now the conventional wisdom on carbon credit is really based on atmospheric carbon. I haven't seen anything really focused on how do you acquire carbon credit for carbonic acid remediation out of the ocean. And so that's one of the things that I've been really recently been kind of thinking about, where should we go? Where should we be pointing our innovators? Where should we be pointing our educators and our inquisitive minds that want to learn more about what our world is today? I think about my 5 kids and what my world was like when I was their age. I've got 2 in middle school, and they just happened to be going back to the middle school that I attended. And we had those old dinosaur Apple IIe and Apple IIc. I think there was a Commodore 64. You've heard them, and the old Ataris. Well, today, we have something even more powerful than those first computers. And, thinking about, what was the conventional wisdom 20, 30, 40 years ago isn't necessarily applicable moving forward. Keeping the integrity of the real wisdom that we all share moving forward and the guiding of these principles, I think is the most essential element moving forward. That we are a community. We're a community that is interdependent with each other. We found, back to the Makah experience, we found that some foes, people that were against our fishing rights, all of a sudden found that we were some of the best champions of preserving a fisheries economy, both tribal and non-tribal. I think, to me, that's an example moving forward in a world where we're all a part of the situation and we all have to be a part of the solution. And that's, to me, is reminiscent of a story my cousin Spencer shared with me one time. He told me about, there was this time of the Great Flood when this particular mountaintop was becoming an island. And once it was pretty understood by all the animals that this island was shrinking, they had less care whether the meat eater was going to attack one of the herbivores. And they started to get more and more crowded. And one of the things that happened was this shock, like a shock down your spine on all the animals simultaneously. And then they all cried up to the Lord for salvation. And by that time, the water had risen in a cylinder up around them. They just had a little airspace. And it was said that the Lord, the Creator, answered them in the same voice that they had cried for salvation in unison. And that the message from the Creator was that the herbivores and the carnivores would have to live peacefully together while they're stuck. And as long as they lived in peace together, they could safely reach into the wall of water and pull fish for the meat eaters and pull seaweeds for the herbivores. And today, I'm really fascinated with some of the science that's been going on about, what is the potential of aquatic plants in bioremediation of carbonic acid in the water. All the solutions that exist for the problems that we've created as a people are there for us to pick up and do something with. And I think the fact that I've made this transition into education as a special assistant to the president of Evergreen State College and have a unique opportunity to help kind of forge new pathways in education, to me is really exciting because I've sat in countless conferences, I've sat in countless symposiums on energy, on resource management, on all these different issues that I've touched on. And one of the prevailing messages coming from an older generation of professors and teachers was that there's a growing need for interdisciplinary studies. The curriculum of our future has to be forged with new ideas based on sound, logic, but it has to happen sooner than later. And the old systems of teaching haven't been fast enough in its retooling of itself. And it's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we face is something that I don't think is impossible to address. And I got to share one quote, I think, from Dan Basta. Dan Basta and I went toe-to-toe on a wave energy project. He didn't want it in the sanctuary, and I didn't want him to prevent it from being in my tribe's traditional territory. But he did say one fact, that after Pearl Harbor, the United States of America, whoever was in charge of this decision, pulled some of the most brilliant industrial minds together, about 12 of them. So whoever they were picked, I don't know, but they were people that were given a mission. The United States was not the war machine it is now. It became a war machine as a result of this response to a global threat. So when the United States decided it was going to go to war, it took what it thought was the most brilliant minds in re-engineering our industrial capacity. And they rose to the challenge, and we've become a superpower. We've become a superpower dependent on other people's resources. And national security has been heavily complicated by our dependence on other people's resources. I used to joke, how come the Americans went to the moon? Anybody heard that one? Yeah.
You know why they haven't been back? Because we know.
So how come the Americans went to the Middle East? Even when ocean acidification and global warming and climate change is part of reality. And I'm pleased to say that I think there's some conventional energy folks that are really, truly looking into beyond petroleum. And we'll get past this oil age the same way we got through the Stone Age. Any questions?
You said the overall flow of the watersheds on the Olympic Peninsula is diminishing.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I think the carrying capacity of the environment to hold water has been compromised. I think of a story that I was told that my great-grandfather and the generation of seal hunters were able to anchor sealing schooners in Makah Bay off of Wyatt Beach. And to anchor a sealing schooner that close in a protected harbor, it must have been a lot deeper. And I would imagine that after a couple of rotations of logging practices, the erosion would send all of that out. Just as what we're seeing, what was held behind the dams, is creating a whole new beach area. And I think about, once I was a little kid, not really a little kid, I was a teenage carver, but I knew what a block of cedar looked like and felt like when it was bone dry and when it was wet. Block of cedar, soaking wet, like 4 times as heavy or more. What causes that weight difference? It's holding water. And so when you think about an old-growth forest with this much topsoil and this much moss and other communities, it's a bigger sponge holding more water. When the topsoil is less, there's less water retention. And then less water retention and more extreme runoffs, scouring of the watershed, there's less habitat.
You mentioned the connection between the Hoko River flow and the prison. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, the prison community needed a water supply, and just like every major river around the whole Pacific Northwest that has been named after a specific tribe, people need access to fresh water. And so when you import a prison system with how many people requires how much water, and then you got to draw it from somewhere. And we went through it in Nia Bay, where we had a moratorium on building houses. We couldn't build more houses because our existing water supply wasn't capable of keeping up with demand. And so it's just a municipal reality for human sanitation that we need water. How we manage that water, I think, would be an interesting way of looking at, can we import technologies from, I know there's a really cool system in Vancouver, BC, but over in Japan also there's been some pretty neat systems that have been put into place.
Well, are they drawing it directly from the Hoko, or anyone else that are affecting the Hoko?
Well, I believe in any river system, any riparian zone is also impacted by, or a well that's connected to a riparian zone, they're interconnected. And so just drawing water out will cause in-stream flow declination. And I don't know the numbers, but I'm sure there's some folks that either between LWA and Makah Fisheries Management could probably measure a disparity in how much in-stream flow has been reduced in the Hoko versus other watersheds that haven't been as impacted.
Well, I've got to apologize to you for that, because there's a couple of county commissioners here tonight that could have asked that question at the time the prison was being proposed, and we failed to ask that question.
But jobs. I know what it's like. I've sat in a tribal council position where, what are the trade-offs? What are the compatibilities? But, it just come to my mind because a few years ago I was sitting at a budget table and we were contemplating, what is the worth of this Hoko hatchery? And what's the history? What's the long-term perspective of the success rate, or how could we define success of this Hoko hatchery? And I can't get into too much more about that, but it caused me to think about it. And I know my dad used to catch a ton of fish out of that river, and I used to be a little kid there when he was doing it. And so even in my 42 years of being aware of things, I've seen some differences myself. But I think about one of the water challenges that we face, and it was in the papers here. Was that 2005, Mike, when we had the water crisis in Nia Bay? 2006, yeah. We had the longest drought in our area for a long time. I think that's another factor. You think about we watch the news all the time, and when the Pineapple Express comes, what happens in El Nino years or La Nina years, that Pineapple Express gets moved up and down the coast. It doesn't just come into areas as predictably as it used to be. And I think the same thing with fisheries management issues too. Set line surveys that do stock assessments, traditionally at the same place at the same time every year. It's not accounting for the seasonal fluctuations due in part to climate change. And so the way the hydrological cycle is changing around the planet, some places are going to get a lot more water than they've ever seen. Some places won't get the water that they used to get. So there's a lot of factors. I can't imagine, how to quantify them all. And Mike, I'm sorry I brought up the Hoko River in the prison. I know I got family that's got a career up there, and we're doing pretty good fishing still. It's not the best, but we're doing what we can. But I think those are good examples of what can we retrofit. I think that's going to be the exciting part. How do you define economic opportunity and sustainable construction? And then,
the thought I had was on seals. That really is living off land. What you can grow or raise or kind of gather. When the Europeans came here, the seal was a major part of the diet of people here in Washington. I've never eaten it, and I've known some older Indian people that have. I've heard that the California sea lion is really good. I think the Indian people didn't have to eat them again. I don't know. I've heard they concentrate a lot of toxins, but then of course that means you have to change a lot of federal laws. I was really curious what it feels like to seal.
I think a good experimental modeling of ecopathing would be an interesting way of approaching that. Sound science, I think, is, once it's politicized, it's not good science. I really strongly believe that. I think if you were to come to another planet and look at its systems, and you have no bias because you're not from one faction on the planet, think about it that way sometimes. I think, but I know we got a lot of Scandinavians who have a rich history, and actually, it's been said that some Scandinavian and Nordics had actually come to America before Columbus, and some of them have been probably, some of their descendants are now members of the North Atlantic Marine Mammal Commission, where they're managing seals and sea lions. They're actually doing something, in a sense of how to really understand the different impacts of different species living in the same community. And so some of the fish, that they're fishing is what they have developed in their own definition of sustainable fisheries practices is they've also learned to account for how many whales they harvest can directly impact the abundance of fish that they're also fishing. So there's some, pretty interesting science there. And I think coincidentally as well is that I happened to be flying to D.C. one time, and I was picking up a Scientific American, and lo and behold, I'm thinking about the Blue Ribbon Panel ocean acidification, and then I see an international scientific expedition on ocean acidification in High North off of Norway. And so I was, really excited to see that, it's a global issue, it's a global phenomenon. I think the GMF experience for me was, pretty interesting because that happened to be just 2 years before the Makah put together a delegation to go to Anchorage, Alaska for the International Whaling Commission. It was Aboriginal subsistence whaling quota year. And I got a chance to meet with some of my professional counterparts, so to speak. And so I met with the French commissioner to the IWC, and I met with the Belgian commissioner to the IWC. I met with the German Green Party. I think there was a staffer working for the German Green Party in the lower house of Parliament for Germany, and they have a huge influence on German policy at the IWC. Didn't get a chance to meet with many of the folks from Italy on anything connected to IWC or in Bratislava. Slovakia was kind of shut down when I was there, but it was interesting to see, the community of human beings from different parts of the world. We really have a lot in common. And I got to mention something I think is of historic significance is, the fact that we're talking about water. We have coming up is the 40th anniversary of the Bolt decision on February 5th and 6th. The Northwest Indian Fish Commission will be convening a day of reflection and a day of looking forward. What have we done in the last 40 years? Well, I can think of how Indian governments have become much bigger in the number of programs that we're dealing with. The Fish Commission has become much more than a record-keeping organization in those 40 years. We've compacted the clinic out at Nia Bay, and I'm talking like I'm still there. We've created new relationships with the Coast Guard and EPA. The government-to-government agenda of tribes have become much more diverse. But what more do we have on the horizon? There's a lot more we can be doing. And so the fact that, this is going to happen, I'm really looking forward to the educational opportunity. What can we learn from that experience, both on how to do things better, but also to build on the successes of what's happened with co-management, resource trusteeship, and I think thinking about this event and the human face of it, and the fact that we are in a multicultural paradigm. It's a fact. The world's smaller than it ever used to be. Our communities are more intertwined than they ever used to be, and there's a lot of division that has kind of been going away. And one issue I have to share. There was an elder Quinault lady that I was talking with about this Bolt decision in storytelling. There's a couple of projects I was looking into finding folks willing to participate in this, and this one elder was telling me a story about her and her husband fishing off reservation, and they were getting totally harassed. I mean, just almost violently harassed. And her husband recognized the guy's voice. And it was like, was that you, Fred? And this white, angry person all of a sudden had a name in this Indian's head. And then this scared Indian and this white, angry person all of a sudden recognized that the Indian had a name that he remembered. And all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, we played football together when we were in Hopeland High School. And we were friends. And so the polarity of what was going on, who was leading the charge of the different sides of the argument, had two friends that were not of the same race all of a sudden diffuse that situation. Stress levels. And so to me, that's one of the most powerful stories I've heard. I mean, I remember having my dad telling stories about how he had to bring a gun to the hobo because there was a lot of ugliness going on down that way. But the fact, again, back to how do we move forward and build on these positive experiences. You were waiting first, and then sorry, Mike.
Well, I just wanted to say that I'm struck that your concept of retooling education and retooling science and the importance of interdisciplinary action is clearly facilitated by cultural diversity. And I hope you continue on your education path. Yeah. Because it seems to me you could create a great synergy out there.
Yeah, I think that's part of my purpose in what I've been doing is pulling great ideas from a lot of different people, and sometimes people don't agree. If somebody hears one thing they don't like out of a presentation, they don't remember the good parts, and I try to remember it all and wait to have any attitude or judgment until I've fully understood it. That's part of the native tradition of listening, being good listeners. Because I think good listeners and good visionaries can eventually become really good ancestors.
So one of the institutions that you helped set up was the Intertribal Policy Council. Could you talk about that? And has that transferred to any of the other sanctuaries?
No, it hasn't, but there's been some effort to lift some kind of better coordination with the Western Pacific Fisheries Management Council and the sanctuary systems out in the Pacific. So some of our native counterparts in the Western Pacific are dealing with a real one-way battle right now. They don't have the treaty rights that the Washington State Treaty Tribes have. And this brings me up with another one of these issues that I think really needs some objective scientific appraisal of what this ecosystem in Hawaii is going through, where, sometime in the past, the green sea turtle in Hawaii crashed. And for whatever reasons, fisheries practices, traditional use and poaching, I don't know what all the different reasons were, but the green sea turtle population in the whole Pacific kind of crashed too. And so, these laws got put into place to protect, Endangered Species Act and all these other things. And so what's happened in these last few years is that there seems to be a very notable abundance of green sea turtles off of the shores of Hawaii. And they're still protected. So tourists who happen to not be able to avoid them can get fines. Indigenous populations that traditionally ate them can get in trouble for harvesting them. But some people are looking at this dynamic where they think that they're starting to go beyond this traditional range of nearshore and offshore and starting to look for forage food up these riparian zones in Hawaii. And so some people think that what really needs to be examined is what is the impact of a very healthy, maybe overpopulated population of green sea turtles on essential fish habitat for juvenile fish in the near shore, where all of the seaweeds and things that grow near shore was a traditional food, but it's also areas where fish can hide and do their juvenile fish things. So that's one example of an issue that some of our friends in Hawaii, Western Pacific, looking at how can we develop more of this coordination. But yeah, I think the IPC, I think, has a lot of opportunity. One of the things that I was really hopeful to see was the development of an ecosystem-based management system that was built on real solid science. And so we were working on how can we get Navy intelligence on the seafloor process so it can be revealed without declassification. But looking at the toolbox of the federal family is really powerful. And if you only have access to parts of it, you can't get the bigger picture understanding of what we need to do. One piece of science I think was really interesting, and Dr. Young and Gao, we've done some work on identifying separate populations of Puget Sound as a whole different system in the outer coast. There's some surface water interaction, but then there's some really, I think, unique physical attributes of these two different bodies of water that create a whole different ecosystem. So I think just in short, the Puget Sound Basin is deeper than the outflow of the Straits of Juan-Fuca. So there's some water that never leaves the Puget Sound or the Salish Sea. And it'll create, I think, a pretty unique system or unique opportunity to kind of forecast ocean acidification. And so I think, some of that work in the future, I think, is going to be interesting to see where different areas can be more resilient when ocean acidification gets worse. But to me, I think the more important focus should be on how do we create safe havens. Imagine if you can, and the people of London can create these big seawalls that close off the Thames during storm surges. Why couldn't different communities that depend on the ocean create these enclosures to mitigate and protect some bodies of water from increasing levels of ocean acidification? But it's a whole new sandbox, I think. Did you have a question?
Micah, I really appreciate your optimism in believing that somehow we're going to figure our way through things. I appreciate the way that you described the crisis that we're facing, and you mentioned this idea of a lag time with respect to the ocean acidification issue, that there's this 40-year lag time. And that seems to be the case with the climate crisis in general, that some of the things we've already set in motion, we won't really see the full impact of for maybe some decades. But we appear to be getting toward some very serious tipping point. And I wonder how, given that lag time, how the urgency of the situation can be communicated in a way that people will see that something needs to happen soon. Then I see, first of all, I've admired your art for years. You're an amazing artist, and now I realize that you're also a great communicator. And so I'm just wondering, in your travels and your thoughts, what do you think is going to have to happen to raise the issue in the average, maybe the average person from a country like this, raise it high enough in their consciousness that they see that something has to get done soon?
It's a really good question. Social sciences going to have to be a part of it. I think incentivizing people, really needs to be done in a way that is commonly relatable. People can get gut feelings. Doesn't matter what culture or race an American person coming out of a movie theater, if a good movie can make you go through all those range of emotions, doesn't matter if you're black, white, Asian, Indian, or, I think finding ways to just cut out the crap. When some emotions are used to jade your opinion, this part of where people look at something in a different sense, they won't see it for the truth. And so I think, some of the American values, individualism, and, doing it yourself kind of thing, it's going to, be a broad range. But I really think the innovators and the folks that need to get things together, there's already a bunch of people out there trying to do it. They're just not coordinating themselves. And then there's, I had one analogy, there's some that want to get rich quick. And I'm no stranger to people coming to Makah saying, "No, we got this great technology, but we need you to get a government grant." It's like, all our other priorities. But I think there is an effort to try to vet the most low-hanging fruit, viable opportunities in sustainable development. There's some really good technologies out there. But I think it's going to have to be a local-based approach. We don't have the solar energy that Eastern Washington has. We have wave and wind and tidal. The energy and the nutrient load in municipal solid waste and water waste. There's a treasure trove of value in what people are flushing down I-5 corridor for algae fuel. Algae is also been recognized as a bioremediation for water quality. So it's just, how do you integrate all of those resources in a way that makes business sense? Literally, you could put fuel in a diesel truck by flushing the toilet because it's going to go through a algae field. It's those kind of solutions just have to be, I guess, real, not pie in the sky, logical, makes sense. I think part of the bottleneck on these solutions is some folks out there just want to get rich off what they think is a really good clean energy. And the reality is energy shouldn't be hoarded, and greed should not be a part of people's use of energy. It should be more of our public domain. Water, food, clothing. The future of humanity shouldn't be so bunged up over basic survival. I think about the quality of life of our people, where we could have leisure time for days and weeks doing artwork, telling stories, doing things. Some couple hours a day, maybe you have to get some wood or water. But that's a post-scarcity society. We were so far beyond survival mode that we could develop sophisticated societies. You could do these things that other people came and tried to squish all that out and make us like them. And look what happened to the world around us. And I think holistically, there's this common nature of humanity that I think needs to be reawakened. Because I think about the days when everybody lives much closer to the natural world than we do today. And I think waking up that inside of everybody is a part of it. But a lot of people are still stuck on what's really real. And so those have to be put together, in a way that's relatable and understandable and desirable. Because we still have a lot of conspicuous consumers out there. And hey, I'm one of them. I want to look nice today.
Could you say something about the legal status of treaty whaling? I think I lost track of that.
Brian Sevek, you mind? I'll just, based on what I remember, we have an environmental impact statement that has been redrafted, and I say we as American society has spent, American taxpayers have spent a ton of money on this and a redesign. Not as much as I'd hoped, but because I think you spend the right amount up front and you put away a lot of the snittle. But basically, what the federal government is trying to protect is a defensible document that cannot be easily dragged into court. And so, the issue with the Marine Mammal Protection Act and this legal paradigm that's kind of pushed us into a way to go through this Marine Mammal Protection Act that wasn't designed to accommodate a treaty process. And environmental impact statements being sort of like this trigger point that has to be done before an NMPA process can be put into place to consider the waiver of the NMPA. And the two biggest questions, I believe, in this environmental impact statement for the feds to consider our waiver request is a population of whales known to some as residents. The West Coast Pacific Feeding Aggregation is sort of a scientific term for these whales. And I have to beg the same question I did about the seals and sea lions and the population levels of seals and sea lions at the time of the NMPA in comparison to the carrying capacity of the watersheds that supported their feed. What was the carrying capacity? What was the population of the what we call the resident whales today, back when they were listed under the Endangered Species Act? When the Pacific gray whale was listed, how many residents did we really have here? And some people are trying to create this scientific policy that these resident whales have to be separately managed and completely protected. Not a whole lot of questions on the resiliency of the population. What's the optimum sustainable population, optimum sustainable yield? But I remember that when we first started this issue, first started looking at these management issues and the impact issues, it was said by hunters in the north that the whales were being more aggressive, and the feeding range of these whales that we share this border with the Chukchi natives, they had been continually hunting them longer than our attention span on this particular issue. And so some of the indigenous perspective in Russia had seen this population grow and become more aggressive and territorial with feeding grounds. And so some of the dynamics, I believe, in recruitment for this resident population, I'm just using it for lack of better terms, their range has been growing too. And so trying to manage a formula for impact. But one of the more scary things was that there's a Western Pacific group of great whales that's much more heavily depleted than the Eastern Pacific. And they say they found 2 of them off the coast of Oregon, which means how does that complicate a bycatch plan for a Makah effort? And so there's a couple of pretty tough questions that try to answer for that. I don't want to. I don't think it's my place to really talk more about it. I'd rather defer to my counsel, but it is part of the public process, and I would encourage people that are interested in, and I would respectfully request that you be respectful and unbiased in asking questions in these kinds of forums. But it's in my belief that there'll be some kind of public meetings coming up sometime in the near future, setting the stage for the ALJ process. And so the system that we're stuck in now is this waiver request is waiting for a more complete environmental impact statement before it can go into an administrative law judge process. The ALJ process will consider the actions of the federal government in response to our waiver request for the MMPA. And I do have to caveat all this from my memory. I'm not speaking for the Makah Tribe.
I took environmental sciences course, and it's not only made me fearful for our planet, but I want to get more in an activist role. But what a problem I see is how do you make people understand how our planet is in such crisis when you still have people that believe global warming is a myth?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I think it's hard for people to deny. And in my global explorations, either on the internet or in flight, I came across Kiribati in some of my studies, and they're the lowest lying group of islands in the Pacific. All the Pacific island nations and small island nations, there's no chunk of land that they inhabit currently that's like over 2 or 3 meters high from the sea level. And one article I read kind of told a story about how some of the indigenous elders of the Kiribati people had become pretty devoted Catholics, and they denied climate change for a long time while it was being talked about by their president, and they had to back off of their denial because they'd been there long enough to see what's happening to their island nation. Kiribati bought 5,000 acres in Fiji, and the president of Kiribati has been looking for a place as a refugee nation. And part of the reason why I was so interested in Kiribati and looking at it was I was introduced to this technology, and Brian was there in Washington, D.C., where this Green Energy Council invited us to be introduced to a person moving forward after a government contract. I mentioned the Navy technology earlier that can take the carbon dioxide out of the water and mix it with the hydrogen at the surface. Well, how do you power that process? And the technology that the Navy wants to use to power that process is called ocean thermal energy conversion. So the idea is that if you can get a body of water that is at least about a 40% difference, so it's like, 70 degrees surface water, 30 degrees deeper water, and that you can prime a pump that will generate a perpetual current by using the heat conversion. So the warmer water will warm up the colder water, and it creates enough of an energy source to power as much as 100 megawatts. And so the Navy, eventually would like to see a 100 megawatt OTEC device to power their jet fuel technology. And to me, I was thinking about, one of the things I heard from this purveyor of this ocean thermal energy conversion energy company. Think about, again, the largest surface of the planet is the ocean. So what's the largest solar energy battery on the planet? It's that warm energy stored in the ocean. And so it's a solar energy battery, basically, if you look at thermal energy conversion. And it can happen year-round, 24/7, as long as you're able to maintain a connection to a 40-degree difference. And so that's one of the technologies I think should be compatible with. Another guy I met was Jonathan Trent from NASA. And he has this idea and been working on a project to create a colossal at-sea algae fuel production facility. And I think some of the folks that he'd been talking with, there's some labs in San Francisco, and I remember getting a call one day from somebody in San Francisco that wanted to lease 40 acres of Nia Bay Harbor to float algae bags. They wanted to punch in a line into our sewage outflow. And so when I talked to Jonathan Trent a few weeks ago, I was like, did you ever think about OTEC being married with your Omega project? He said, yeah, but the nutrient load is what's missing. And then the location. So, you've got some pretty brilliant scientists looking at some solutions. And so I'm thinking, well, what other sort of things can you develop in the nutrient load? So I was kind of brainstorming one night about Kiribati. And Kiribati is a pretty big seafood producing country. There's only about 50,000 people. So I was thinking, well, geez, if you do a closed loop seafood aquaculture production, you create the nutrient base for an algae fuel, and then you can energize all of that with ocean thermal energy conversion. So I'm still brainstorming. Who's got the money to do that? Who's got the smarts to do that? It's a great idea, I think. But that's why I'm really excited about, getting more involved with people doing education. I love sharing with people, what I think are good ideas, what I think I've learned from other people who I thought had really good ideas. And, I'm happy to say that I've been sort of a participant in a lot of PhD students' efforts to write their dissertations and master's theses, and hopefully eventually do my own soon. And so one of the unique things I think we'll be able to do in the near future is a student-originated study. Just a group of students together and let's figure this out.
We have time for one more question.
One, yeah. Do you have one? Or? I don't know what time it is. I should. Yeah.
I just wanted to say briefly that there is a local group that's been formed called Olympic Climate Action. There are members of the group from the Bay all the way up to Port Townsend. And so if anybody does want to get involved in local action, let me know.
Yeah, we need to. So I think my email's online at Evergreen State College.
Okay, Steve, we have to wrap up.
I just want to say thank you for being, more than, indigenous person in North America, but being a global citizen and taking this water thing very seriously. And I really appreciate everything that you've done for it.
Well, thank you. I guess just in closing, I want to just say that I think I've had so many ideas that I know I'll never be able to do. It's just one of those facts of life. Maybe it's my midlife perspective that, all these great ideas I used to dream about, I'll never get them done. If I can get a couple of them done, yeah. But if, we share a lot of common vision with people that I may have never met yet, that those ideas are more common than I realized before. And so, whatever I think is a good idea, I know somebody else has already thought about it. And so if we can plant seeds and motivation as we go, somebody will get it done. And I just tickled pink about this one thing that happened just about how you plant a seed and how an idea can take on its own life was that when John T. Williams was shot in the back in Seattle by a police officer, I was like, what can be done to help heal this situation? And I shared with a few people close to the family and a reporter about, a healing pole. He's a totem pole carver. And sure enough, a few phone calls. There was minimal effort on my part of this, but just the idea took fire with a group of people, and it happened. And I got to see him carve, his brothers and family carve on the canoes, or the totems. And so that's why I'm always happy to, share ideas and learn from others about, what's going on, because you never know who will pick up, what has been left before. And I know I've been influenced by what other people have done, building on what's been left before me. Thank you.
We tell a lot of stories, so we learn a lot of things through stories and experiences of different people in the club, different members of our club. And so through your journey and your experience and your travels and your stories, I've learned a lot today. So thank you very much. Learning the importance of water and environment is important. Thank you very much for being here. Can you join again and say thank you to Micah McCarty for being here?
I thank you all for being here too. You've been a great group. I know there are a lot of friends and family here, but I think good listeners can really help somebody speak what their mind is and what's coming from a speaker's heart. So thank you for being here.